The second one. At one point, he must have said something that his wife had been decisive in this whole thing. And I think it goes back to Andrapol, the recognition that the state was in shambles. More so than the immediate threat from the Americans. And I think in the history book, Gorbachev will still be one of the great leaders of this century.
Not very popular.
He would have done a lot more than that.
Well, it was another topic. I don't know.
Okay. Okay.
But he always gave him credit for being sort of the initiator. And I think that's probably Trump.
Not a great figure.
No, he seemed to be like a nomenclatura. Alright, now I believe it was a little bit difficult to lead the company. Although, in a very strange thing, as I said, because I was very happy to lead my job. We had a very good American who now has left the company too, Thomas Capel, a very good man. And the trouble about this whole venture is they have so little willingness to have different journalism or different culture. And the products are so extremely
That's why I will have to look over your head.
This thing what do you get? Are you going to where? Yeah, you should come so we will have collections with you soon. Okay. Are you going to be here tomorrow? I will, but I will have lunch with Bill Counts. Yeah.
I just lost my seat.
No, thank you.
es sieht ja schon den ganzen Tag da gelaufen. Ja, heute Mittag schon, dann gestern auch schon. Hatte nichts anderes zu tun. Ich weiß es nicht. Also ich hab zum ersten Mal Bush gehört und ich war echt sehr überrascht. Da scheint er schon mal gut anzukommen. What was the question again? We can learn.
It's a good crowd. It's a good crowd. We probably have about 500. The lights are very bright.
Where do you want that?
No, you can't change the lights. Sorry.
Excuse me, sir.
Okay, does that preempt you, or does that?
No. Just, I didn't want to. 5 is so short. But it's not. It's more relevant that I not preempt you.
Are we all hooked up? Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, the Dean of the Kennedy School. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this forum on Germany 10 years after reunification. This is sponsored or co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee, the Vinda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies, the German McCloy Scholars here at the Kennedy School, and the Consulate General of the Federal Republic. The topic, Germany 10 years after reunification, is really quite fascinating. I remember when I was a graduate student here taking a course from Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger had this wonderful phrase. He said, a Germany which is big enough to defend itself in Europe is big enough to frighten the rest of Europe, and therefore Germany can never be reunited again. And I also learned in graduate school that Germany was once a geographical expression, that in the early part of the 19th century there were hundreds of German states. And then Bismarck came up with a solution which is 2 German-speaking states. And then Hitler tried another solution, which was 1 German-speaking state. And then after World War II, the settlement was 3 German-speaking states. And the conventional wisdom 10 years ago was that 1 Germany was impossible. You could never have European stability with 1 Germany. And the thing that's most intriguing is that that conventional wisdom of 10 years ago has turned out to be wrong. I confess that I, at that time, 10 years ago, thought that the strength of Russian, French, and British opposition would make it impossible for Germany to unify so quickly. And it is intriguing that not only was the unification accomplished so quickly, but that it has gone as well as it has. I mean, if you think of Germany today, a democratic country tied to its neighbors in the European community, this is a Germany which is a success story. Indeed, it's interesting that just as Britain proved the strength of its democracy by firing Churchill after he had led them brilliantly through World War II, the man who oversaw German unity, Helmut Kohl, is no longer chancellor. You might say that's sad in one way, but in another way, it's also a symbol of the strength of German democracy. So in that sense, I think the conventional wisdom of a decade or 2 decades ago has been turned on its head. We have seen quite an extraordinary accomplishment with German unification. and the role of a democratic Germany in the heart of Europe is very different than it was when I was a graduate student. So I think it's interesting to check ourselves every once in a while and admit when we were wrong, and to be glad of it from time to time. We're lucky this evening to have a very distinguished panel to discuss these events. We're going to start with, to my left, Joseph Joffe, who is a PhD from Harvard University, indeed once taught here, among other places such as Stanford and Princeton. Joe is now co-editor of Die Zeit. He is formerly was the Süddeutsche Zeitung, frequent contributor to the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, and other journals. Indeed, I find him one of the most perceptive analysts of Europe and of US-European relations. To Joe's left is Rüdiger Dornbusch, a very renowned international economist. Rudy Dornbusch is the Ford Professor of Economics and International Management at MIT. He has his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. And if I just listed the number of governments and agencies for which he's consulted, it would probably take most of the rest of the evening. But a very impressive resume indeed. To Rudy's left is Guido Goldman. If I can be permitted to say this, Guido and I were graduate students together and sat through some of those courses that I just mentioned that Henry Kissinger conducted. And Guido is director of Harvard's program for the study of Germany and Europe at the Center for European Studies. He was also the founding director of the Center for European Studies. Indeed, he is chairman of the McCloy Scholars Program here and was instrumental in helping to create the McCloy Scholars Program. Guido has done as much as anyone I know who in the what you might call the private civil society dimension of US-German relations. He has been a real linchpin of US-German relations in so many ways. And to Guido's left is Charles Mayer, who is the Krupp Foundation Professor of European Studies and the current director of the Center for European Studies, a longtime member of Harvard's history faculty, and a very renowned historian of post-war Europe and Germany. And just as if I had read Rudy Dornbusch's many lists of commendations and consulting for various governments, it would have taken the evening. If I had read all of Charlie Mayer's publications and list of publications, it would take the evening. So I won't. We'd rather hear from them directly. And let me start with my friend Joe Joffe.
Thank you. That was a very sweet introduction, and it reminds me of another Henry Kissinger story, and I'll use 2 minutes of my 10 to tell that story, how he was being introduced by a then German ambassador at a Princeton conference. And the guy said, here's a man, no man needs an introduction less than Henry Kissinger. And then he proceeded to introduce him for 40 minutes. But Henry Kissinger in those days, that particular day, was in a very good mood. That's when he reached the lectern after 40 minutes. He said, it's true, no man needs an introduction less than I do, but nobody enjoys it more than I do. So I think, may I speak for all of us, we enjoyed it. You already mentioned that I went to Harvard, and since I went to Harvard and studied mainly with your colleague Stanley Hoffman, with his French connection, so I feel compelled to make 3 points. And I want to talk about 3 things that didn't happen in the last 10 years, two of which, the non-events, are actually quite heartening. First of all, the first thing that didn't happen was the Fourth Reich. Do you remember 10 years ago, everybody was talking about the Fourth Reich, especially all over Germany's neighbors, the Brits, the French, the Italian even, thought that or feared that once Gulliver, once unchained, would take to the road again. He didn't, and why didn't? Why didn't he? Because I think this time reunification took place on a very much nicer auspices than last time round. It was not done by blood and iron. Indeed, for the first time in German history, this Germany was encircled only by friends. It was the first time in history that Germany had been almost completely westernized, no longer compelled to play East against West, and vice versa. And why did all of this happen? Well, initially, of course, democracy came on tank tracks. But very quickly, the West Germans, at least, took to democracy like fish to water. And that was an unbelievable cultural transformation. And why did it proceed so smoothly? I think because this time democracy was not associated with defeat and humiliation and depression, but with prosperity and soon international respect. So for the first time, Germany was not the most exposed country in the middle, but part of multiple Western communities, which gave the Federal Republic a shelter and a role. So I think that benign environment, for the first time, sustained liberal democracy and prosperity and spelled a kind of normalcy for Germany, or better, even for the first time, the Germans had the chance or opportunity to pursue power and interests within community rather than on this fabled German Sonderweg, separate path of development. And the nicest thing about it was that having done all this, it turned out that cell phones and wingtips worked better than panzers and jackboots. So for this time, the Germans were enormously successful pursuing power and interests within community. And that left a very powerful message that whenever they struck on their own, historical message, it was disaster. And whenever, now like after the war, they pursued their interest and influence within community, they flourished beyond belief. And that, I think, is why Gulliver rechained himself right away as soon as the fetters of the Cold War had fallen away, and why this united Gulliver pursues and keeps pursuing a grand strategy of self-containment and not the Fourth Reich. Here's the first thing that didn't happen. Second thing that didn't happen, not so good, the blooming landscapes didn't happen, to coin a phrase used by Helmut Kohl. And that economic failure in Eastern Germany may well be the downside of my first point, the downside of this culture of ultra-stability, predictability, unwillingness to accept change in this post-war culture, unless that the losers of change are handsomely compensated. So this culture plus a bad conscience led to reunification as a friendly takeover with essentially unwanted, unfriendly effects. Essentially, the West imposed its regulations, rituals, and wages on an economy whose wage level in '89 was 1/7 of the West German level, and which is now 70% of the West German level 10 years later, but with productivity lagging way, way behind in the high 50%. What does that mean? If you do that, if you inflict your wages, your regulations on that kind of area, where entrepreneurs have to pay higher wages than productivity wants, capital will not go there, right? It's very simple. So essentially, the takeover destroyed the East German economy, and not to find a point in it, it turned Eastern Germany into a welfare case to a large extent. How much did it cost? Well, there's one nice figure. '89, West Germany's national debt was 900 billion Deutsche Marks. It's now 2,300 billion. The difference, 1.34 trillion Deutsche Mark, is more or less what the transfer between the West and the East comes to. Which takes me to the third and last point, the third thing that didn't happen. Now you may think that this decade of rather unhappy development in the former GDR should have left behind a population marked by melancholy, moroseness, and resentment. There is, of course, some of that. because after all, Germans would not be Germans unless they discovered a cloud in every silver lining. But that's German. Americans are the other way around. But my paper, Die Zeit, so I got a little plug here at the end, has just commissioned a poll in the former East Germany that it really is quite surprising and heartening. 80% now state for the record that they no longer have any trouble in this new post-reunification world. They have accepted it. 1993, 7 years ago, when we did a similar poll, less than a third saw themselves as winners of reunification. And today, that proportion has doubled to 2/3. Interesting change. And also 2/3 say that their hopes regarding reunification have essentially been fulfilled. The most interesting question, because we started out with this new liberal democratic Germany after the war, the most interesting question was this: what do you prefer most? Do you prefer a kind of liberal democratic state that leaves you freedom to choose and to fail? Or do you like the paternal protective state? There's a nice measure of authoritarian tendencies. And 2/3 of East Germans say now we like the liberal democratic limited state, which is almost as much as in the West. So in other words, economics may still not be right, but the politics seem to be getting righter year by year. And that too, I think, was unexpected. That the essential political culture would close the gap so quickly, because you might have, so in conclusion, 3 things again: no Fourth Reich, no blooming landscapes yet, but also none of the alienation and resentment you might have expected on the part of those who were the takeover object of Bonn, Inc., and who had previously spent altogether 60 years under one totalitarian regime or another. So that's 2 good ones out of 3, and the best news is, I'm going to stop.
Rudy?
But since everybody obliges with Kissinger stories, I'm probably unique in the audience to have had him as a babysitter. He was a military dictator in the town I come from in Germany in '45, and he was dating someone in the house. And while she was doing the dishes, he was babysitting me. We've heard
and what was he doing when she wasn't doing the dishes?
He's there to be asked. We've heard a very positive view of what is happening in the former Soviet Union, East German part. And I want to focus on the economic issue. And of course, the economic issue is the one that is most difficult to assess. I think it's important to ask that question because the enlargement of the European Union to the east will involve very much the same issues, and probably it will be postponed because it's too expensive. Korea is looking at the risks of the same situation. So this is not going to be the last one, and the lessons, I think, are very important. I think the whole story of the success of unification is well told by something that happened in Peru when the last military government fell. The cabinet got very, very drunk, and at the end of the party, the defense minister staggered to the door, and he said, "Lady in the red gown, can I have this last dance?" And the person said, "Certainly not, and for 3 reasons. One, you're totally drunk. And second, my gown isn't red but purple. And third, I'm the Archbishop of Lima." And the point of the story is that things aren't always what they seem. And I think East Germany is very much the case of that. I think there is a catastrophic failure of the economic experiment, and that is made obvious by the fact that today in East Germany, wages are higher than in the United States, with productivity levels that are perhaps half. That something went wrong there. Of course, as a result, everybody's unemployed, and since they're well paid, they may even now have gotten accustomed to it and be happy. There is a huge amount of transfers. Today, it's of the order of 33% of East German GDP. Being subsidized by 30% is pretty hefty for a whole country. Something must have gone wrong somewhere along, and there isn't a mechanism in place to actually say D-Day is coming in 3 years and all this is going to be over. On the contrary, this will have to continue being financed, and I think it's a failure in the East and is being perceived increasingly as a failure in the West. If you could say that, but of course on a birthday you have to be more positive. But that was last week, so we can be a little bit more candid. The first view of why it had to fail, of course, is the usual one for post-communist societies. There are no market institutions, and if you don't have market institutions, it will go wrong. Like Russia, you get oligarchs. Anything goes wrong, certainly don't expect high growth, fast catch-up. But of course, that is not the case. East Germany had the total luxury of getting within 24 hours the best institutions that West German money could buy. West German institutions, including a money, you name it. So that very, very common issue simply wasn't there. It was also not that people didn't know who would be on top, who could run things, management, experience, language. No, they got all of that from West Germany on the second day. No issue there. So where did things go wrong? I think there are two theories. One is that East Germans are just lazy, and that's because after 60 years of communism, you're paid to stand there, but not actually to do something. The notion of quality had disappeared. The notion of individual responsibility had disappeared. So doing good economics is totally impossible with people who had had that experience, whatever they were like before. And I think that that is really contradicted by what we have seen in a lot of other post-communist societies next door, or Vietnam for that purpose, where there is a boom underway. People learn capitalism very, very fast. So I don't believe that is the answer. The second answer that is very common in the West was to say productivity is low to start with. You can't help that. The wages have to be in line with productivity. And if people are pretty useless, then they have to be pretty cheap. And if they're pretty cheap, then capital will go there. And that's how it's going to have to work. And you can't really change that, because without it, there is no development model. I think that that is contradicted by what happened afterwards. The one-to-one conversion that was so controversial really was followed by wage gains in the East that were more rapid than in the West. So if the conversion had to be at half wages, then they would have doubled immediately, plus the increases that came later. So I do believe that the monetary institutions were good, that it took one controversial issue off the table, and that certainly we wouldn't have had a low-wage East Germany, everybody sitting there pat rather than going across the street for West German wages. So I don't see that that is the answer. I think the answer is really that there was a wonderful agreement in West Germany to make East Germany into the mini-me, if you have seen that movie. Right? And the mini-me means that they got West German unions, including a culture of high wages and lots of people paid not to work, that they got West German institutions of a highly regulated economy, because that provides social cohesion, and that West German capital went along and said, give us enough money, and we will have totally capital-intensive enterprises in the East. That's a wonderful subsidy. And give them a lot of money to spend, because that way we can have a boom. And 89 was the all-time best year in the past 40 years for West Germany. So a wonderful agreement between a government that wanted to be sure to win the election, the Social Democrats that had to compete, and the unions that wanted their way. East Germany is not going to be social dumping. It's going to be overpriced and unemployed and paid not to work. And German business that went along and said, give us enough of a front-end bargain there in terms of purchasing power, and give us enough subsidies on investment, and then we're even willing to work with East Germans. And that's what we have. Everybody got exactly their piece. East Germany is the mini-me. It looks even worse than the real thing. even worse because the productivity differences are there. It's hard to uproot the West and put it entirely in the East. Plants are all totally capital intensive. Nobody wants to go next to the workers, so they're unemployed. Not free. The numbers are formidable of what it costs. But also, where is the alternative? Well, you couldn't have had East Germany as a low-wage labor camp. In Korea, people are flirting with the idea of having a really big fence with permits. Some people say, well, taking the wall down was the big mistake because that was much easier to keep them there. Well, I don't think that that was a realistic option. And for history's sake, thanks God nobody tried that, because how would the Soviet Union have evolved and all the East? So where does one then look for an alternative? I think the genuine alternative was that West Germany had contemplated what was about to happen and had said, we have a very, very bad economy in West Germany. It's over-regulated, it pays people not to work, it's very, very inefficient, it's very high cost, and here is our heaven-sent opportunity to get rid of all of it and have then, with East Germany, on a par the same economic model. The transfers would have been avoided, the unemployment in both parts would be less, the fiscal problems would be less, and most importantly, in East Germany, we would not have what we now have, real resentment. That Paul says that everybody loves the West and they can't get enough of it and they want to marry everybody from the West, and the West is just so cool. But that's sort of not the reading you get. I refer to...
You're telling me our paper lies?
No. I don't even say you paid them for the right birthday answer. But remember what The Economist reported last week. It was a really stunning number. They asked 14-year-olds, is it all right to kill foreigners when you don't like them? And 40% said yes. That is a formidable number. I have no clue how the survey was done. I assume that The Economist's publication means that there is some credibility to it. And I think that's the underside. East Germany has been put on welfare. East Germany resents the second-classness that is obvious in every respect. And I think it is made worse by the open-ended welfare system rather than by people making it by working very hard, which was the West German self-confidence after World War II. So exactly the opposite happened, and I think that's why there is an ongoing issue, resentment in the West for all the money that didn't really buy what you wanted, and resentment in the East for being second class and continuing to be that very clearly. So I believe the message from that experiment is there's another chance. The East now is asking for less regulation, for freer wage bargaining at firm level, all the things that are music to economists, and the West is fighting it tooth and nail. I think there is a chance that the East brings the right economics to the West, and that the West should just accept that that way they'll save a lot of money and they get a far better economy, and that might well set the terms for integration to the East, terms that are still discussed exactly as the East German integration has been discussed and has gone wrong. Thank you.
Thank you. Guido?
I'm not going to start with the Kissinger story, except to say that picking up what Joe referred to, when we were in graduate school, if you read the literature, and these were wonderful books, including Henry's Troubled Partnership, or Zbig Brzezinski's Alternative Partition, and dozens of other titles, none of them would have suggested the scenario that then occurred. For me, as a social scientist dedicated to area studies, and particularly trying to educate myself and students on Europe, it was a shock, I have to say, that the literature and the profession failed to develop any scenario that anticipated the events as they occurred. And that shock all the greater when after the wall came tumbling down. Well, it didn't tumble. It was courageous people who made it happen. But then we saw it was virtually inevitable that something like this would happen because of the impending collapse of the economy in the East. I mean, the cost of trying to stay competitive for the German Democratic Republic was just enormous. None of this was taken very seriously at the time, and it remains one of the big puzzles for me in looking at the events of these 10 years, which are basically a very successful story, that we were unable to see it as something that might develop. And I think it's something that in due course maybe we'll get a little bit more insight into why we were so unable to properly assess the weakness of the other side. The fact that this was unforeseen or unanticipated also meant that almost all of the policies that then emerged were improvised. And if you accept that as being fair as an assessment, you have to give it a very high positive grade, because to have emerged over 10 years with this kind of success story, even with, and I completely share the views of Rudy Dornbusch, but this kind of process of trying to bring unification about in a way that works, and doing that without a game plan that had been sort of developed in advance, is really rather remarkable. And remarkable, too, because it required a timetable that was very aggressive. On the one hand, it wasn't clear at all that the Russians would accept as low a price tag for removing their forces from East Germany as it turned out they did. And secondly, which also is an indication of how dire the circumstances economically and socially were in the East, but also an aggressive timetable because unless, and this is one of the great achievements of Helmut Kohl, unless the process of unification in Germany coincided with rapid integration in the European community, stress points could easily have emerged along the direction that Joe properly says didn't happen, which is the fear of a Fourth Reich. Germany gaining the additional potential power of the East without being integrated in a process of rapid integration in the West and Europe as a whole, I think would have been a somewhat different and perhaps more frightening development for its neighbors. Also fortuitously, in terms of these 10 years, we had an economic boom. I don't think the economic boom came about because of the events we're describing, but they coincided with it. And that, of course, made things somewhat more feasible, certainly created opportunities which might otherwise not have been. But it was, I just want to say, it was an act of rather substantial leadership, even if mistakes were made, that brought us to this juncture 10 years later. However, a process of this kind cannot be without a cost. And I think it is premature for us to sit here, at least certainly for me to sit here and say, I think I know what the cost is. I think part of the cost, clearly, is played out in terms of the young generation in the East. And part of that is going to be very difficult to resolve. And unless it continues to have a sustained priority, it can be very disruptive, and disruptive in a way that's particularly difficult in Germany because of the German past. So if you get manifestations of negative views towards foreigners, acts of violence against them, the painting of swastikas, whatever it might be as a form of protest, this within a German context will be played up much more in terms of the media and will be taken very seriously because history tells us that one has to pay attention, or that one at least should pay attention. So in this situation, I think that's at least one of the costs. The second cost, for which I do not have the expertise to evaluate, is I think it did accelerate the process of European integration a little bit too rapidly. I don't think that's terrible, but I think that to some degree, the commitment that Kohl had to really push very hard and very fast has created perhaps some processes which are more difficult to fully achieve under quite as rapid a timetable as, but that's something perhaps is controversial, others wouldn't agree with. I think also in terms of Germany as a whole, I just want to close with this, something that Rudy Dornbusch alluded to is also a cost, and it's a missed opportunity. It's asking too much to really blame anybody for this, but there was an opportunity to bring change to the Federal Republic, institutionally and in terms of some of the fundamental ways in which government and the economy are shaped. And that didn't happen, probably couldn't have happened, probably a system overload to try and do that at the same time you're trying to deal with this kind of improvised scenario in which there were many other ramifications, including, I should say, the degree to which Germany has played an extraordinary role in trying to contribute to stabilization of the post-Soviet economy, so that it wasn't just the price of transfer payments to the East, it's also the enormous price of trying to sustain stabilization or achieve stabilization in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But it's a missed opportunity in the sense that when you start to create the conditions of integrating a part of Germany into the Federal Republic, there are reforms that might have taken place which possibly were easier to do then than they will be in the future. But overall, I have to say that my view is that this is a remarkably successful process.
Charlie?
Okay, I've got 4 points, a minute and a quarter for each. First of all, I remember this occasion 10 years ago when I spoke to the McCloy students and other students here. They were listening to what was Genscher's midnight address on October 3rd. And I said this was not my country, but I was very glad for them. I think it was a heartening development. It was made possible by brave people in the East and sensible people in the West. The fact that it took everyone by surprise is indeed, it's not a mystery, and in the sense that every great transformation takes people observers by surprise, and then, as Tocqueville said, looks terribly inevitable afterward. We'll always go back and find the sufficient, there have to be sufficient reasons, and we'll find them, and not only will we think them sufficient, but necessary. One of the things as a historian I drew cheer from was the capacity to be surprised in 1989. It's good for all of us, social sciences especially, to be surprised periodically. And this was a nice surprise. There have been not nice surprises in history, too. Secondly, the conditions of unification. I mean, I agree with both Rudy Dornbusch and Guido. Look, we had a picture, in a sense, we'd been prepared for a picture for 40 years of the Cold War, that two Germanys would come together. That was a fiction. The Germany that came together was, in a sense, 1/3, 1/4, almost 1/3 the size of West Germany. It was, it roughly looks like North Rhine-Westphalia and perhaps a small lot. Its productivity, of course, was lagging. Much of its industry was rather Potemkin village-like. But there was the notion and the ideology of two Germanys coming together. And the fact that, from the viewpoint of economic efficiency, these solidarity wages were imposed was, of course, regrettable, and yet, I think, very inevitable. And as I think Rudy recognized, the price that was natural to pay. In fact, it's really one of the only places where solidarity there was a commitment to solidarity. Because as Guido said, too, and I think this is important, this was an opportunity to avoid needed reforms in West Germany. I'm not sure it was thought through that way, but it was, in a sense, a heaven-sent capacity to postpone. You had university overcrowding, and you had too many would-be academics in West Germany. Send them east. You had a welfare system which was rigid in West Germany. Argue that it had to be given to the East. You had unions who were suffering attrition throughout Western countries, rescue their position by talking about solidarities in the East. You had a constitution. The constitution was a good one, but nobody had to think about refinement of the Constitution. It was kept through at the time of unification. So that this was, I don't know, I don't think we could have, or Germany could have solved all those problems. There would have been institutional overload, but nonetheless, this was a time when problems could be shoved off because of this particular, the mode of unification and the commitments to a somewhat fictive solidarity. The third point I want to make very quickly, I think Germany as a whole is in a period of more rapid social and cultural change in the last few years than I can remember, having observed it now for roughly 45 years. I think the pace of the mentalities changing in this society is huge. And perhaps it's because I see very cultivated young people who come as students, but the whole liberation of capital markets, the use of English as a language, even the debate that it might become an official language. If Germans won't agree on how to spell their own words, but they are seeming to agree that they must all speak English. The amount of travel. There's a tremendous sense of flux and westernization. Now, That means, this is my final point, of course, there are those people in our societies who do not make it in this world. And in the German situation, they are more localized in East Germany because of all the difficulties that the previous speakers have suggested. There is, in a sense, a two-class system. And the lower class expresses its resentment, feeling left out, with all the antisocial and vicious behavior that, especially in Germany, and of course this is what they would choose in Germany. It's the one that's most designed to get under everybody's skin because it comes with the burden of National Socialist history, etc. But I would suggest, and this is speculative, and it's my last point, while this takes German forms, I think this is a common problem in the West. I think all our societies, as they go through this fantastic crucible of post-modernization, are generating a large number of those who will not share in this, who do not have the skills for it. Some of them are migrants, and they are assigned these places, and some of these migrants will work their way up, and some will not. Others are those who are not learning the skills or are left out. It is a particular, when a synagogue is burned, that's a German problem, of course, and it's in the paper as such. But I think in this sense, Germany has the normality that we all have. In my book, I wrote that Germany, East Germany, in a sense, was leading West Germans and us all into a certain community of insecurity. And I believe that the way to understand this, in a sense, is to take this framework and go outside of Germany and think of the general trends that have been overtaking us all throughout the West, even as we've gone through this tremendous period of prosperity and social loosening up. And there will be downsides, but I think we will have to interrogate ourselves about them as well as the Germans.
Thank you, Charlie. We now have time for questions and answers with the audience in the panel. There are 4 microphones, 2 on this floor and 2 in the balcony. And I'd ask people to line up behind the microphones to ask their question. I would ask them also to ask questions, not make speeches, which means keep the question relatively brief. You may designate, if you wish, one of the panel to answer the question, or you can make it an open question, in which we'll try to share it out amongst us. I would also ask the questioners to please identify themselves for the benefit of the panel and of the members of the audience. So let me start here.
I'm Rolf Hardy. I have one question which I think is relevant to the discussion about the adjustments of East Germany to current conditions. And that is the problem I read about quite a bit of migration within Germany. That is, those people who were particularly skillful, not waiting for things to happen in East Germany, but moving out, leaving behind a somewhat poorer, less educated population in East Germany, so that people were migrating to the capital instead of capital moving to the people inside of Germany. And I think there has been, I'd like to have some comment on that, because I think it's an important issue that is going to continue.
Do you want some numbers? The number is about 2 to 1. I think 2 million went after reunification. After reunification, 2 million went west, and 1 million went east. Among the 1 million that went east, of course, a lot of people didn't really go to East Germany. They went to Berlin, I think. So the half of which was the west. And the other half of which is very rapidly becoming very rich east. The reason I'm citing these figures is that the essential reason for this perverse development, perverse economic development that we've described here, is precisely what you said. You know, the famous poster: "If the Deutschmark doesn't come to us, we will come to the Deutschmark." And add to that this enormous fear within West Germany, touched upon, of change. I mean, the idea of change is so frightening to the basic culture that the idea of having another 2 or so, 3 million flock west into a very rigid housing market, by the way, where every new increment of demand gives you 3 increments in price because there's no supply effect. All these fears generated this crazy takeover, and nonetheless, people kept coming. So today I ask myself, why didn't we accept lower wages, lower levels of benefits? They came anyway, and in so doing, we might not have so utterly destroyed the East German economy.
Any others?
Well,
yes, Rudy?
I just add, the migration is not primarily east-west skilled people. It's people with initiative, as is always the case. Now, of course, that's even worse, because the skill compression is pretty high in the East. Education is pretty uniform. When you lose the people with initiative, then it's going to be a lot harder to do something.
Charlie, you want?
Very briefly, though, Americans always had a theory that the most people with the most initiative came to the United States in the 19th century, and that's why Europe would sink deeper and deeper into sloth. I don't think, I don't think this works out genetically or behaviorally. Good people come, and
how did you get
what's
here?
with Sweden and Denmark?
but that
All
doesn't
these
mean that the
Vikings
masses
left.
of people behind that these countries completely.
The cool people in Denmark and Sweden all left. They went to Sicily, to Byzantium, everywhere else, and never came back. That you get Denmark now. Apologies to all Danes, great and small.
There will be many Cubans left.
A lot of Cubans.
We'll leave this discussion at this point. The other microphone on the floor.
My name is Matthias Huth. I'm a visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies, and I am an East German. I cannot share the pessimistic view on the state of the East German economy. Since I'm an economic historian, I would like to share some figures with you. There's a study published already in 1991 indicating that the GDP per capita in East Germany was in 1950 at 52%. Over the course of 40 years, it decreased to 30% at 89. Now we have almost 60%, and I'm asking, that's a nice development within 10 years to double the GDP per capita that was lowered to this low level. Certainly, the problem is that how the GDP was increased over the last 10 years, and I think the mistake of the former government was to stick on construction. To give you another figure, the SED had a construction program running in the 70s and 80s, and 600,000 construction workers were employed to fulfill the party promise to provide everyone with an apartment. And after the unification, more than 1 million people worked in construction industry in East Germany, creating a growth all over the East German economy while hiding the process of deindustrialization that went on. Now, construction industry is in decline, shadowing the process of reindustrialization. The figures in the industrial sector are quite well. The growth rates is 2 or 3 times higher than in West Germany. But still we have the problem of high unemployment among construction workers. Could you comment on that?
Rudy, you want to?
I don't know where the comment should be. I can comment on the numbers. The best numbers money can buy from the Munich CS IFO says in 91 it was 31%, not 40. In 98 it was 56, but those are your numbers, right? So you're good on those numbers. West Germany bought construction, and when the construction was done, that was over. I don't know, that happened in Switzerland and that happened in Florida, and I don't know what the point of that is. That these people don't work now, well, there's unemployment compensation, there's no important self-employment, the thing isn't working in adjusting. Why? Because they have West German institutions. So I don't see where you say this works. This doesn't work. someone pays for the roads so that the Bundesbank can bring their big safes over bridges, then you get a little bit of growth out of it, right? And when that program is over, then the guys are going to sit at home and do nothing.
Okay.
So you made our point very effectively, I think.
I'll add one quickie. The interesting thing is you might think this is going up, and the real problem is that productivity has been stagnating at about 59, 58% of West German levels since 1996. So there has been a stagnation effect here, which is puzzling and at the same time somewhat depressing.
I think that's easy to explain.
Well, how would you explain it?
The West Germans invested highest state of technology in the East. So you couldn't do catch up because you had the best. Right? And so for 10 years you live off the best until you need to replace and catch up with whatever has happened elsewhere. That's why the productivity was so high, because you got the brand newest, finest equipment that West Germany couldn't sell anywhere else.
So why is it stagnating?
Well, after
why is you have capital formation at that rapid a clip?
Poor countries catch up, but if they give you the best machine, there isn't a lot else to be done.
We have to give the crap. Given the bad
then you get higher productivity growth and a lower level of GDP, right?
Okay.
But I think it is really this state of the art that everybody recognizes. The equipment was the best.
Let's go to the balcony.
Thank you. My name is Han Gu-yo, and I'm an MPA2 student from Korea. As a Korean, it's amazing to see the success story of German reunification. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from German experience. I have two open questions. First is, what do you think of the recent development in South and North Korean relation in terms of German reunification experience? And my second is, if there are some costs that German could have avoided if they had prepared beforehand, what would that be?
On Korean economy, Rudy, you want to try that?
I wouldn't worry too much about the problem, because the US, China, and Japan are in agreement that Korea is so wonderful, they want two of it. And the only problem is to get Japan to pay for it. I do not believe that you're going to see anytime soon events as you had in Germany with a chancellor like Kohl, who understands that he has one bullet to move history and did it formidably. So I don't believe the Korean timetable is unification.
Right. And if it happens anyway, then keep the wall, put a big sign on it, say closed for renovation 20 years.
The other side of the balcony, I can't see whether, I don't see somebody on that mic. All right, let's go down here.
My name is Amina Daman. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, one of the new McCloy Fellows. Some of you mentioned the word reform. So I was actually wondering, what kind of reform did Germany miss out? What were they supposed to do? And how would this reform actually ease in the process of reunification?
For you, Rudy.
I hear the tendency of less involvement of the government into the economy, but maybe you have some more specific proposals.
Well, I'm happy to supply a Harvard answer to this. I'm not from Harvard. There is a team in the economics department. Andre Schleifer is part of it. They've looked around the world. How many steps does it take to open a business? And it's really wonderfully done. And it confirms all your suspicions. Austria is world championship with 17 steps, and it cost, I think, $20,000 or something. Germany is 12, and it takes 3 months. Here is a wonderful opportunity to say, what do you have to do to open a business? In Canada, it's 2, and it takes 24 hours, it costs $200, right? So I think that's where it starts, just stopping people to work all the time. That's where it starts. Half the number of bureaucrats, get rid of all the restrictions to people forming a business, stop paying people who don't work, stop taxing the rest for it, deregulate markets to get far more entry. You want to go on for 20 minutes? But I would start with this wonderful study that says, how difficult is it to open a business? Bill Gates went into his mother's garage and just did it. right? He didn't even do the 3 steps that you have to do in the US, and I haven't put him in jail yet.
They will.
They will, for other reasons. I think that is real. If people cannot open a business, if they cannot work unimpeded, you're going to get that kind of society where everybody is paid not to work. And it doesn't really produce great results. If you're very rich, you can run it like that for a while. But in the end, you run out of steam, which is what is happening now.
Guido?
There are, of course, also institutional changes. Just give one. This was a golden opportunity to revisit the question of, do you really need as many states in the federation as you have? And there was some discussion of it, but under the pressure of various goals that had to be achieved, maybe that wasn't of the highest priority, and it was a missed opportunity. I don't know if it's a grievous one, but it's the kind of thing that would have been easier to do at the time of integrating the East than to try and do in some timetable now.
I must say I'm tempted to put a question to Charlie as our historian on the panel who talked about how once something happens, it all looks inevitable. Was there an alternative way of reunifying Germany at the time? In other words, was there a way in which you did not import the structures from the West to the East?
Well, I wanted to say, before I say that, let me preface that with something. I mean, I'm listening to this about opening a business. I don't know how many people want to open a business, and employment doesn't necessarily depend upon opening a business. Remember, for 20 years, for 10 years, we looked at Germany from the United States up until through the 1980s, and we thought this was the real success story. We thought that a highly institutionalized economy with the cooperation of business and government allowed for local investment, as in Baden-Württemberg and elsewhere, which seemed to work. And then it didn't seem to work. My friends the economists, I think, have very short-term memories about the changing nature of prescriptions. We once loved central bankers, then we hated central bankers, now we love central bankers. It's just, we are always, so the trouble with solutions is not that they don't work, is that they work very well, and then we stick with them during conditions when they are no longer going to work. But it's very hard to know when the conditions, where the point of inflection is, so that this doesn't work. I think this unification, I agree with, I think what everyone said, worked fairly well. The problem of, yes, one could not have put other institutions in the East without putting them in the West at the same time, because the East was too small, and there was an argument about egalitarianism. West Germany could not have said, we will let East Germany be a model of the Manchesterite or the Thatcherite type of Reaganite type of market economy, while we stay in our cozy, cocooned business government Rhenish capitalism. That could not have existed. So it's inevitable, but in the sense that I don't think the results are necessarily would have been. Were not irrational, or the choices were not irrational. And what we need to know now is, my own view is that the university system, for instance, which is something I know more about, here was a place where reform could have been tried more differently, perhaps a different federal structure. In retrospect, we know all these things could have been done differently. But at the time, it's always at the time, hindsight is wonderful. At the time, the choices were not irrational. East Germans were clamoring for the mark, at the full revaluation of the mark. It was a fantastic electoral strategy for Helmut Kohl. There were arguments that it made sense. It was not, I think, as Rudy was saying, was not the major drag on the economy. Each of these choices could be justified. And in retrospect, we could see many of them would have been better had reform come earlier. Look, that's history. History is always too little, too late, and sometimes we can live with it better. The one last thing: the problems of East Germany about productivity and income are somewhat reminiscent of those in South Italy. The economy and the GDP in Sicily has gone way, way up. The degree of autonomous generation of income and investment remains low. It is not easy to get a self-sustained process of growth going. It sometimes takes half a century or more. So some patience is also, I think, is called for. Guido?
The problems, in my judgment, are not just economic. It's a question of identity and alienation. And there were discussions at the time whether the pace of unification, remember there was the discussion of whether there should first be a federation of two states, an interim period before the full equalization and integration of the East, equalization under circumstances in which two very disparate partners were competing and trying to be equal. There were concerns at the time when de Maizière, you see, my theory of this, I don't want to go on too long, otherwise it's not appropriate for discussion, but one of the problems here, and the reality of the situation was that from the West, this became also a reservoir of voters. And as a reservoir of voters, you had to superimpose the parties of the West and try and get that to be successful. And Helmut Kohl was very successful in doing that. He, of course, had the instruments of power and of the Deutschmark. But he did it, and to a large degree, the success of this was the fact that democracy immediately ratified what was proposed. But if you said in an ideal circumstance where you didn't have the pressure of dealing fast with Gorbachev and trying to sort of deal with the coordination of all the Western, because the French and the British were not particularly enthralled with the idea of unification, would have loved to see an interim position which might have been frozen for quite a while. And I think Kohl made the right choices, but if Joe's question is, what about an alternative? An alternative, if you say it was available, would have tried to create some kind of legitimacy for some of the experience of those in the East. And that's a very mushy thing to say in a certain sense, because it wasn't realistic. But the fact that didn't get addressed, and one of the really interesting issues at the time was I remember people saying there should be a ministry for reconstruction. There should be one agency that would address the grievances of the East. And of course, that wasn't wanted. And that kind of a process, which would have been somewhat different, might have diminished some of the problem we have of alienation, but also might have had very costly consequences that we wouldn't favor at all today.
I think there should have also probably been another constitutional convention. It would have been a great symbolic act, of a constituent of getting people together from both sides. Yes.
I'm Hannelore Munson, and I was born in East Germany and spent my youth there. And I must admit, I have not heard any mention about making Berlin the capital of Germany in East Germany. And I wondered what the panel feels, if there might be future positive effects that have not been felt yet by making Berlin the capital of Germany and having at least the political seat there.
You?
Very good point, and somebody should have mentioned it. And the converse, if Bonn had remained the capital, and this was not a clear-cut issue, it would have been very costly. I think the symbolism of rejecting Berlin as a capital would have been of very significant consequences.
I can't see whether somebody's in the balcony.
I think you have someone there.
So let's go down to the mic here.
Hi, my name is Stefanie Friedhoff. I'm a Niemann Journalism Fellow here at Harvard. And I have a quick question. I'm missing one point here. Do we have a racism problem in Germany or not? And what do we have if not?
What's the problem?
Do we have a
racism problem?
A racism problem. Joe, you want your most recently come?
Of course there's a racism problem. And the problem of racism is strongest where they are the least racist. I mean, i.e., in the East, where proportionally speaking, in the old days there had been no foreigners there, except maybe for a few Russians and Vietnamese. I mean, fraternal comrades coming to study at Karl Marx University or something. And they're still a very, very small, compared to the usual 8%, which are about par for Western Europe, 8% foreigners, it's still much less there. So it's the old problem, just like there is in Hungary and in Poland anti-Semitism without Jews, so you have, I think, a more pronounced racism in the East without foreigners. And the reason is very simple to me. I'm not going to blame our East German brethren, simply because there was an anti-foreign and a racist tradition in East German in the GDR history. I mean, they are very contemptuous of foreigners, there was no, and of Jews, by the way, and of Zionism and all this kind of thing. There was not exactly an encounter with foreigners of any stripe in the East, plus an ideology which did not look too fondly on others. So we have a problem. There's also a problem in West Germany. Is it more than there should be? Is it more than, quote unquote, what is normal in Western society? You know, there's a certain amount of nasty people, a certain proportion of nasty people in any society, except it comes out differently in various societies. I mean, in France, there is a racist party, and so it soaks up Le Pen and his Front National, so it soaks it up. In Austria, there is Haider and his party, and maybe it soaks up that. In Germany, there is no such party, which is a great thing for post-war German development. There was the extremes on the left and the right were lopped off. So you might say, well, there's nothing to channel and discipline and tame or domesticate this kind of stuff. You know, in the United States, deviant behavior takes place in the Michigan militia or Idaho militia. So I would end this painful topic by saying what makes me happy is that there seems to be no more racism in Germany than elsewhere throughout the West. And that's progress to me compared to, say, 5-6 decades in the past.
And I might add a quite strong anti-racist sentiment in Germany, which is not part of German history either.
No.
I think so. Charlie, you wanted to add?
Well, I was. Joe made the point I wanted to make that in Germany you have a skins problem, you have a violence problem, ugliness. You also have immense provincialism among many people, but you don't have the parties. There's a certain taboo that happily still clings to that, and no party has come close to the NPD of the late '60s, I don't think, and it's roughly 10% of the electorate. Still, it's clearly a problem, and insofar as it's centralized in a certain probably age stratum of people who will take violent action, of course, any of these incidents are too much of a problem. But it's not an easy problem, and there are still attitudes. In America, Germany, for all the adaptation of English, is still very uptight about the language as a cultural cement, and whether this is maybe a value we applaud, or it's not up to me to applaud it or not, but it's clear that there are attitudes of enclosure and outside and inside, and being outside a community for people who are living there, which are very strong. And my hope is that over the next few years, that sort of notion of outside-inside dissolves a bit.
In the balcony now, I see you.
My name is Ingmar Hartl from Germany, and I would like to have a comment on the role of Helmut Kohl. 10 years ago, during the Reunification, would it have been possible without him? And right now, where it's clear he broke the Constitution, and please comment on this.
It's a very interesting question of the role of the leader. Would this have happened without Helmut Kohl or not?
Of course.
Who would like, Charlie, you're the historian, counterfactual history.
Is 10 years ago history?
I think what Guido said was crucial here. I think we would have had, Kohl had an immense Fingerspitzengefühl in a moment of opportunity, and the Russian situation could have changed, was the argument for going quickly. I think probably the economics in the long term were such that eventually the East Germans would have had to make more and more concessions to the West, which to keep themselves afloat. But you could have had a much longer period of confederation, of Zweistaatlichkeit, of hesitant measures. I think what Kohl's contribution was, and I believe it was a great contribution, was he saw an opportunity and he got really what is a maximum solution through with an immense degree of consensus very quickly. My own view is it's hard. This was a great achievement. It's not necessarily over the course of a lifetime a great man, and those are different things.
Guido?
There's no question that he compromised himself grievously with the party financing, but to historically try then to diminish the achievements of that period, I think would be a mistake. I think that this was not one man's doing, but it was fortuitous that you had this kind of a leader, and he was very focused and very determined to do both things, bring about the unification of Germany and accelerate the process of integration of the West. And I think not everybody would have made that choice. I think that was a very important pairing. And I think also that his success in winning elections meant that this would be a sustained process. Lots of things could have been done better, but it's really quite a remarkable achievement. Unfortunately, the scandal of the party finance is a very serious matter and will serve to be much more than just a blemish on his role in history.
Rudy?
Well, on the party finances, I think that's sort of a European thing where every leader of the 70s and 80s now finds that the Chinese proverb, clear water, no fish, is the new fashion. I think that Kohl never had respect for good economics, and maybe that helped him, like Kissinger, that helped him make the quick decisions that were essential. When his view is history matters, and never mind the details, and perhaps also for campaign finance. And that was totally right. The issue was the next day, having done it, to open up a debate on how to take advantage of it.
Joe? I'd like to make a pitch for Bush, George Bush. Not W, but the elder. Now, I would never presume to intervene in the internal affairs of another electoral system, but the one thing that is really underplayed and undervalued in all this is how none of this would have happened without the United States. And what George Bush and the fabulous Baker boys and girls, Condoleezza Rice, for instance, and Phil Zelikow, who was here, and he wrote the book on it. What they did was like, I don't know whether you've ever seen curling, which is this, whether you have these heavy pieces of something and you kind of shove them along the ice. And sometimes when you watch them do it in Switzerland, there's somebody always walking in front of this thing as it moves and kind of polishes the ice. This is what the United States did. I mean, except it was not a broom, it was a bulldozer. And so they shoved aside one rock after another. I mean, first of all, Bush kind of pacified Thatcher and Mitterrand, who were livid about the prospect of reunification. And then he held the ring for Kohl by holding off Gorby. And what was then still seen as rather, quite impressive Soviet power. And if you follow these machinations, then really Bush does play that position of kind of brushing the ice, as it were, except he did it with a bulldozer. And that's much undervalued in all of these things. The United States had not accepted German reunification as something that needed to be done, and therefore they kind of took the ball and ran with it. No, wait a minute. Wrong metaphor. Kohl took the ball, and the United States ran interference, okay? I got it straight now. Without that, I don't think it would have worked. I'm really quite strong on that. Kohl by himself could not have pulled this off.
I tend to agree. I think this was a much closer call at that time than it might have been. I mean, the Soviets didn't have to give in quite as easily. No. They could have upped the price, and it really is a very remarkable thing that they got this through. And the French and the British were quite strongly skeptical, and I think the Bush administration diplomacy was quite remarkable. It was an amazingly adept example of American diplomacy. But with all that said, I still think that Kohl made a difference. A more cautious politician could have given time for the Soviets to have had second thoughts, to have some of the outcomes that Charlie said. So whatever else one thinks of Kohl and the overall balance of history, I think one has to give him credit for that period.
Also, we trusted Kohl, and we might not have trusted somebody else.
Yeah. last word, Rudy, and then we'll go to...
There is a story that Chancellor Kohl told to a group of us. He was in Berlin watching the manifestations, and an aide found him on the balcony with a phone, and on the other side was Gorbachev saying, "Are your tanks running? Ours will be running." And I think that's where Kohl had the decisive word. I think Bush sort of was nice to be around, but what would Britain have done?
What tanks? Panzers?
Yes.
Was he getting ready for a little war?
That's the story.
Or who do you think who deterred
Never
Mr.
trust an
Gorbachev?
eyewitness.
Well,
Who do you
Well,
think?
we'll settle the history later, but because we have time for one more question.
My name is Alexander von Richthofen. I'm a writer and producer of documentary films. I would be very appreciative to celebrate this 10th anniversary and not having some thoughts of mourning. And I cannot agree harmonizing racism in Germany. We, in our identity, therefore we have such a weak identity, have a big black hole. The years 33 till 45 are a big black hole in most Germans' identity. Psychologically, quite reasonable, because who wants to identify with negative aspects? But how do you think we could fill this big black hole? Otherwise, racism in Germany is not like racism in any other country. And education maybe is something, but education was there. So how could these things, like the synagogue, the recent synagogue attack, like Hakenkreuze in Buchenwald, typical German geography, Weimar and Buchenwald, the two parts of our character, how can this big black hole be filled?
Well, should we start with the historian or the journalist?
Well, we can deplore it, and we should deplore it. We should also know that we cannot have a perfect society unless we impose means and ways on that society which just demolish perhaps even just as important values, like freedom and the freedom to assemble, to behave, to yell and say nasty stuff. If you pay that price, we will destroy more things than we are saving by keeping racists, neo-Nazis' skins down. So I think that's the most critical thing that I have to say on this one. The second thing I have to say is for those who naturally, these events that when they happen in Germany are magnified to an extent to which they wouldn't otherwise be, and rightly so, by the way. But to me, the important thing is how society as such, call it the chattering classes like me, or the political classes, or the intelligentsia and so on, has reacted in absolutely the way I would want it to react, which is by reaffirming the taboo on neo-Nazis, on skins, etc., at every turn of the road. That I find the more reassuring thing. And I would not be willing to combat the phenomenon by saying, I will limit the right to assemble or the right to demonstrate. We have to pay that price unless we want to destroy very important liberal values in this society where liberal values were usually honored in the breach.
Charlie?
Look, I guess, I mean, I agree with Joe says you've got to keep within the Constitution. You have to allow nasty people to march. We allowed that in the United States. However, I think it's not only the chattering classes writing editorials, deploring this. I was very impressed when the Lichterketten took place a few years ago. The candlelight parades were an affirmation. I think the number of people who commit atrocities like this is relatively small. I think when they do so because ultimately at some point there's an ambiance which encourages them or allows them, even if it's just their own friends drinking too much beer together in a kneipe. I think it takes people on the street saying, this is atrocious behavior, we will not tolerate it. I think it takes the chattering classes to do more than chatter. It takes a lot of people. That's really what brought East Germany down in part. That's what, in some senses, these scored the past. So I think one should be out there and saying, this is atrocious, and gestures of solidarity at synagogues, gestures of solidarity with migrants. It's not going to prevent everything, but it will remove the number, and it will, in a sense, solve this other problem you say. It will make people feel they no longer have a black hole about that history.
Rudy?
Suppose that the number that I quoted from a survey, 40% of 14-year-olds in East Germany, in a particular town, believing it's all right to kill foreigners if you don't like them. If that is true, you have to do something very, very different. You have to do a radical internationalization. Got to put them on a plane and ship them to America en masse for the summer. And I say that seriously. They have to really see something else other than the environment where something like that can come to people's mind. And public disapproval is wonderful, is important. Politicians are splendid at it. The press is splendid at it, but it doesn't get there. If these numbers are remotely right, you actually have to have a radical program of taking them out for a while to show them that the rest of the world is good, that they themselves can achieve. And how else are you going to do that but take them out of that place for 3 months? And that works miracles for everybody who crosses borders. And in that respect, they aren't worse. I do not believe there's a percent that's evil and somehow they accumulate it all there because it slopes down. I think there is repair to be done.
Guido?
On this issue?
Yeah.
I share that. I mean, I think that we have watched very carefully what's happening, young people in the East, and if the problem is as deep as it appears in terms of the intensity or willingness to perpetrate acts of racism, I don't think it's because this was once the Third Reich. I think it's because the levels of frustration or alienation or some sense of reaffirmation that protest of this kind of dimension is supported by their friends. I think that is very serious, and I know a lot of German friends of mine are beginning to get quite worried about. I don't regard Germany as a racist society. I think there are, however, this is one of the costs of a very difficult and troubled past in that part of the country.
Well, I'll ask if we're nearing the end of our time. I'll ask if panelists want to take a minute to summarize of anything, or Charlie, any final word?
Well, the last question made me think. I mean, about the virtue, what East Germans discovered and West Germans looked on at in the fall of '89, I believe, was a political virtue that's pretty rare in a television democracy where we sit in living rooms, and it was solidarity. People got out in the streets, they got out in crowds, they were scared. We know in retrospect maybe they didn't have to be quite so scared as they were, but things could have happened. Violence could have occurred easily. Solidarity is a very precious political gift or virtue, but it can't be created every day, and it doesn't maintain itself every day. There are wonderful economic analyses by Albert Hirschman and others of how it dissipates. Yet I think periodically it needs to be renewed. And I think it can be renewed around negative issues. I think solidarity, and Germany faced up to solidarity, at least in its fiscal system after it got the deficits under its control. It still has a solidarity contribution, I guess. That has to be demonstrated periodically, and it can't be it has to be renewed. It's what takes political leadership. I'm not sure how it's to be done, but I think in that type of solidarity. That's the lesson that 89 bequeathed to us all. And I hope my society and every society can draw from that lesson. So.
Guido?
Had we sat here 11 years ago, 10 years ago, and anyone would have painted the picture of what happened, I think one would have said that can't happen. And it did happen. And I think it's a tremendously positive development with all of the difficulties we've alluded to, but I think it's quite remarkable.
Rudy?
I think that Kohl was formidable in creating a fact and just do it. Never mind how much it costs. And that has shaped history, and there is 20 counterfactual scenarios of how things could be far, far worse than they are today, because today it's just a question of money plus a few good ideas. I think the mistake was that the next day people didn't sit down and say, this is also an opportunity, and this cost a fortune, let's try and use it more widely. But that is something he was never good at. He was good at the first and not at the second. All things considered, thanks God he did it.
Joe?
Many years ago, Guido and I were always sitting around and musing about the fact why we were interested in Germany, and Guido's shtick was, well, because pathology is always more interesting than health. Any of the Weimar Republic, the Nazis and all that kind of thing. Pathology is more, that's why we think more about Germany than about Switzerland, okay? Or Denmark. And the point that I would like to leave this very patient and very, I mean, really, I admire this audience here. This audience with is that today, 10 years after reunification, 50 years after what the Germans call 0 hour, Germany is for the first time in its history, I think, back in the Western mainstream. That means with all the failures of the West, with all the perversions and the weaknesses and the pathologies, but also with the triumphs and the strength and the rootedness of a liberal democracy in the face of crises like recession and sustained and enduring unemployment. And so since we have dwelled so much on the pathologies in the past 50 minutes, these pathologies do exist, but I think they still put Germany into the Western mainstream today, and that I find extremely reassuring. It's like the Queen of England, who's something of a wit, was taking her corgis out and near Windsor, and somebody accosted her and said, "My God, you look just like the Queen of England." She says, "How very reassuring."
If I could summarize what I think, before I call on Dr. Hausfedel, the German Consul General, to have the final word. If we had been here, as Guido said, 11 years ago, and predicted the condition of Germany today, I think we would have had something far worse than we have today. And we've described here a Germany which is far from perfect. There are problems, and we should not ignore them. But in the old metaphor of the glass that's half full and half empty, this glass is a lot closer to full than empty. And that is my toast. That's my toast to Germany on the 10th anniversary.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you have already given a good round of applause to the distinguished panelists and to Dean Nye, who is also the host this evening. And I think this was a good idea. It was a cooperative project we had with the Kennedy School, the Center for European Studies, and the McCloy Scholars here at the Kennedy School, together with the consulate. And the crowd, the capacity crowd, which has assembled here tonight, has shown us that this was a good idea. I will not delve into politics tonight. Better things await us in the background, and they will be open straight away. I think Guido has given us a thought which I would like to pursue just with one sentence. He has said, I mean, this was something where we had to improvise, where we had no game plan. And if you ask me, as a German, what we would have thought in 1988, if anybody would have predicted the course of German unity, I, as a good German, probably with many other Germans, would have said, it may work in practice, but it will never work in theory. So that is the thing. We improvised the whole thing, and given the fact that we improvised, we have come a long way. And I was grateful that the dean filled his water glass before he gave the final toast. I would like, before I go into a practical arrangement, I would like to give two specific thanks. One is, of course, to the Kennedy School as a whole, then, of course, to our partners. I've already mentioned them. But, of course, Bill White, the director of the Arco-Forum of Public Affairs, has a major responsibility, and we owe him a lot for this evening. He has masterminded the whole thing, and I would like publicly to give him also a round of applause. Another person whom I would like to specifically mention this evening is our Special Affairs Director at the Consulate, Katrin Pepke. She was also very instrumental in doing this invitation, and I think I owe her a lot for this evening. Thank you very much. And now for the social part of the evening, I would like to ask your cooperation. The bars and the food stands will open right now, but in order to give us a little bit more space, I would like all of you to get up from your places so that all the helpful people can get the chairs away, so we have more room and need not elbow so much. But basically, the bars will open now. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.